Hey, John, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for so much for being here.
Yeah, it's great to actually finally see you in person after a couple years of emails.
Yeah, we've been chatting over the phone a couple of times, but yeah, now you put a face to a name now. So here I am.
Yeah, and this isn't normal on a podcast, but I love your organ supplement. Um,
Oh,
I
okay. I
started.
appreciate that. Yeah, I have him back here, but yeah, I got into that because it was pretty simple. As you know, we have competitors out there. I typed in nutrient dense food on Amazon because I was selling on Amazon, and I saw what they were selling at, and my attitude was like, look, I could do the same quality at a cheaper price, and here I am.
Yeah, well, and you know, I started it in September, and um, this has been the best winter. The past couple winters, I have 6 kids down to a
Hmm.
2-year old. Um, and the past few winters, we've just got wailed on by sickness. And
Okay.
this winter, I've barely been sick at all. And it's one of the few dietary changes I've made. So I'm just like, I'm sitting here going, I wonder how many of these my children need each per day to get the same effect.
Oh, wow.
So,
I did not know that. And this wasn't planned. I'm very surprised you're saying that. So thank you so much. I
well, that's why I
appreciate
wanted to bring it up because again, I'm like, this isn't normal on a podcast, but I've been really thankful and impressed with your organ supplement.
Hey, I mean,
So
you know what? It's kind of funny. Like, I do sell these to make a living. This is my income selling the organ supplements. But when I get feedback from customers, that just takes me to another level. I'm just pumped for the rest of the day. I was like, all right, I have my ups and downs in running a business, but this is the feedback I'm getting from people using it. I need to keep on driving. I need to keep on going. So thank you so much, John.
yeah,
But for the people who don't know who you are, could you give us a background? Like, what's your origin story? Like, how'd you get here? If you give us that insight.
yeah. The short version is uh, around 2003, I was working on my master's, and I basically almost died. So I started to not be able to eat without crippling, stomach midsection pain. And this started probably late 2003. It got worse and worse and worse. It got to the point where I'm 6'2", and right now, this morning, I weigh about 172 pounds.
Okay.
And I was below 120 pounds, I believe, at 6'2". So I go into the doctor, and the doctor sends me for an upper GI, and it comes back, and they tell me I have duodenal ulcers. Um, and for listeners, if you've never really understood what an ulcer is, um, the inside of your body basically has a living protective coating of bacteria, yeast, other microorganisms that coat every single and they exist almost in like a liquid skin, a living liquid skin that coats your inside. And what happens in an ulcer is that liquid skin gets broken through. And so all of the digestive acids and other stuff in in the food you consume and as your body breaks it down starts to hit against your organs themselves instead of against this protective liquid skin. Um, and that's why ulcers hurt so bad. Because if you've ever had like a bad burn on your
Mhm.
skin, and every time you touch it, it just hurts. So you wrap it in gauze or something to keep the pressure off of it. Well, you can't wrap your intestines in gauze. Um, so go to the doctor. I have duodenal ulcer. Um, it's just, incredibly painful to the point I'm not able to eat. I'm not able to sleep. I'm barely, able to function. And the doctor's like, hey, this is no big deal. We'll just put you on these drugs. And I look at the doctor and I go, what do these drugs do? And he pauses and um, he walks over and grabs the drug insert and he begins to look through the drug insert. He's like, this is a protease inhibitor. It shuts off your body's ability to produce hydrochloric acid. And my first thought, which I said internally, is like, I make hydrochloric acid, like the stuff that eats through steel and stone. My body produces this. Like, I'm an X-Men. Didn't say that out loud. I needed medical help, not psychiatric help. But what I did say to my doctor out loud, I go, what will happen to my body if you make it stop being able to do something that it's designed to do?
Mm.
And he pauses and he kind of looks at me. After a little bit of a pause, he goes, I've never thought of the human body this way. It is never, in all of my medical training, I've never thought of this question. And he goes, in all of my years of being a doctor, nobody has ever asked me a question like this. And that was when I realized that our medical system was irreparably broken. That just like these people know how to treat symptoms, but they have no framework for understanding what is the cost when we treat these symptoms, short and long term, to these people, and what is actually causing these symptoms. Where are these symptoms coming from? So through a professor I had, I fell into the world of Sue Gregg and then Sally Fallon. Mm-hmm. And my then fiance, now my wife, and I, we went from shopping at Walmart and Sam's Club and Kroger to shopping at Wild Oats and Whole Paycheck. And, we completely retooled what we thought food was, where food came from, and how it was prepared. And probably after about 8 or so months, I had completely cleared up all of my digestive issues. So it took some front end work and a lot of commitment to change. But I went back to my doctor, and he's just like, this is impossible. He's like, you can't heal stuff like this. I'm like, send me back for a new upper GI scope. More than willing to show you that no, like, the human body is quite resilient if we stop abusing it.
Wow. And then how'd that get you into doing homesteading? Because that's what you're doing now. Like, you grow most of your food. Was that, it seems like that was the start of this to where you are now, right?
Yeah. We grow some of our food. I got 6 kids.
Okay. Yeah.
So we grow a fair bit of food, but my kids eat a whole lot of food. So when we had cattle, we were probably growing about half of our calories. Oh, wow. And so we can't wait to move and be able to raise our own cattle again, because that'd get us back over the midway point. So I start, getting healthy through eating real food. Mm. And the problem was, on Wednesday, I had to go to Bardstown Road to pick up my CSA box. And on Friday, I had to go to this and this place to get my milk drop. And then on Saturday morning, I have to go to this one farmer's market, because that's where the farmer who doesn't feed his pigs crap sells this. And then on Tuesday, I have to go to this other, and I'm just like, who has time for this? Who has time to have to build their entire schedule around going 12 different places to find nourishing food? I'm just like, how insane is this? And I was also a business, finance, economics major in college. And I was in Whole Foods or Wild Oats one day, and I was looking at the pastured chicken. And so this is 2004, 20 years ago. And pastured chicken breast at Whole Foods or at Wild Oats was $10.99 or $11.99 a pound 20 years ago.
Wow.
Very, very cheap.
And I remember looking at this going, who can afford this? And then the flip side of that was what a lot of Americans don't realize is the standard food chain. When you buy food in the standard food chain, the farmer on average gets 20 cents or less on the dollar of what you spent. So I'm looking at $12 a pound chicken breast, knowing that the farmer is probably getting $1.50 a pound. And I'm like, where is the other $10? Where's all of this going? So I started a local food buying club in 2006 called Louisville Whole Life. So we're probably one of the oldest buying clubs now in the country in terms of that really focuses on working with local regional farmers and offering real food to its members. And I start the buying club and I'm looking for pastured eggs. I'm looking for animals raised without antibiotics and vaccines and stuff. And, so I'm trying to find farmers to work with, and I go and talk to these farmers, and the farmers keep telling me, oh, you can't raise things that way. Like, what do you mean? Like, you can't raise fruit that you don't spray with chemicals. I'm like, when were these chemicals invented? 1964. So you're telling me nobody ate fruit before 1964 because you can't raise it without the chemicals? But like you're telling me things that have been around for 30, 40, 50 years, before then all of this stuff was impossible? Like all the animals were dying, all the people were dying? And they just look at me like I was crazy. And I'm looking at them like they're crazy. I'm like, you can't, like literally, like we've been doing things this way for a few decades, and you're really going to sit there and straight face tell me that doing it the other way is impossible. It became completely impossible in the course of 1.5 generations. So I eventually got so tired of hearing this that I was like, fine, I'm going to buy my own farm. So I'm just like, I'm going to show you all that this stuff can be done, because I know people are doing it in other parts of the country. Like, I know you can do these things, or none of us would be alive today. There wouldn't be, guess what? There's like 5 billion people on the planet in 2024. I'm like, instead of 5 billion, there'd be 5 million of us if these things were as impossible as you all say. So we bought, 35 acres an hour outside of Louisville, and we started raising animals and raising food. And I started doing tons of experiments. In some of my other talks, you probably heard, you think, oh, I'm buying a farm. What makes a farm? Soil. And I kid you not, I bought a farm, soil not included.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
So I borrowed a tiller from a neighbor because, hey, what do you do when you want to plant a garden? Well, you till the soil. I didn't know any better at the time. I grew up in Northeast Ohio in an, urban neighborhood, typical middle-class housing. Like, I'd never grown anything my whole life. And the tiller broke before the soil did. And so I was like, I'm not going to let not having soil beat me. So I have pictures from our first year here. I actually did our first garden in cardboard boxes. So that's how we got into more of the homesteading, food growing side of the equation. And because I did not want to live in a metropolitan city. And one of the authors who's really shaped me is an author by the name of Francis Schaeffer. And in one of his books, he says, people aren't made to grow up cut off from the sun by concrete and steel that stretches to the skies. And so I was just like, I don't really want to live in a city anyway. I want to be able to go outside when I want to go outside and lay in the sun and have a little bit of space between me and neighbors who I like. So we moved out of Louisville. I guess we bought land in 2009 and probably moved late 2010.
Okay. Now, the one thing I want to ask you actually is, which I'm happy that the term is coming up more often, is regenerative farming.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the questions that Joe Salatin, one of your colleagues, he answered this. But the question is, because with regenerative farming, the whole ecosystem's working together: the plants, the land, the soil, which is so important. And I don't think very many people realize that. The air, the animals. It's one big ecosystem.
Yeah.
The food becomes more nutrient dense, and everybody benefits from that. But the argument I get all the time is that because of the size, I want to stick just with the US for now, because of the 300 million people in the United States, we had to stick with factory farming so that we could feed everybody. And what's your opinion about that? Can regenerative farming or something close to that, can that be part of the equation?
Yeah. So I'm going to answer this a couple different ways. Um, the first is, there's good books on this subject, like Sacred Cow by Rob Wolf and Diana Rogers, where they go over the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, I was a business, finance, economics, and math major in college. And if you objectively look at the numbers, there is no reason you cannot feed the entire United States regeneratively. So there's more than enough land. There's more than enough space. I think if you look at the numbers fairly, as Joel has shown on his farm, you can produce far more kilocalories of food through well-designed regenerative enterprises than you ever could through the energy loss system that is industrial agriculture. And you can do it far more resource efficiently. But the other way I like to answer this question, when people ask me this question, is I live roughly 49 miles from the buying club I founded in Louisville, its current location. So when I go to Louisville, I have to drive 49 miles. And every time I make that drive, and I tell people, the next time you drive through a semi-rural suburban area, just look as you drive through and estimate what percentage of land is not used at all for food production and could be, or is underutilized in its food production. Because when I drive from here to Louisville, less than 2% to 4% of the land I pass is probably utilized, or none of it's fully utilized in the way it could be for food production. The vast majority of it is underutilized, but well over half the land I pass is mowed instead of mooed. It's, they're just, like the road I live on, it's probably, everybody who lives on this road is probably 500, 600-ish acres of land. And almost none of my neighbors have a garden. I don't know if a single one of my neighbors have fruit trees. Oh, I'd say only a quarter of my neighbors at best have chickens or other meat animals they're raising. And I live in a purely rural area, purely rural. And this is 500 acres. Some of it gets hayed, but that's like it, almost none of it is actually used for food production. We could easily, the issue is not lack of space, lack of land. It's a mixture of laziness and the fact that government subsidies have made it so that there's no longer any incentive for people to actually raise good quality food.
Yeah. I mean, Sacred Cow is a great book, and maybe you could briefly go over this one gentleman, but the book introduced me to a man named Earl Butz.
Oh,
Which,
goodness.
Nixon really knows how to keep on becoming president in our current environment. But yeah, tell the people about Earl Butz, and maybe they'll get an idea of why we're where we are right now.
Yeah. So if I remember correctly, Earl was made the Secretary of Agriculture. Um, and that means he set the policy and tone for U.S. agricultural policy and the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture. And the easiest way to understand Earl is his slogan, get big or get out. So few people have done as much harm to the health of all Americans, but then also the health and stability of rural America as this chap. Because he had these tours where he'd go around the countryside. He'd have these town hall type meetings, and he would tell farmers that they were to get big or get out. And then he forced them to adopt this basically by weaponizing government agricultural policy. So he totally reshaped government agricultural policy in ways that are really hard for somebody who's never studied the issue to understand. Because most people will hear, corn and soy growers receive $10 billion or more dollars a year in government bailouts and subsidies. And that's a pretty large number. But what you don't realize is for every dollar of direct subsidies industrial agriculture receives, they receive another $20 to $30 in indirect subsidies. So for instance, go to any land grant university in America today that has an agricultural program and that does agricultural research. It's all industrial agricultural research. So the entire industrial agricultural system has transferred all of these costs onto taxpayers. Look at the school lunch program in America. It's another indirect subsidy to industrial agriculture. All the foods that it's all highly processed, soy oil, canola oil, CAFO meat. So we have these direct subsidies going on, but what Earl was especially good at doing was basically rewriting the DNA of indirect subsidy programs for all of these big companies permanently. So all of their research and development, all of their recruiting and people development. Every one of my neighbors, if their kids want to go into agriculture, they send their kid to a land grant university where for 4 years the kid is brainwashed into being told that the only way to be a profitable farmer is to raise row crops, spraying them to death with petrochemicals.
Mm-hmm.
And so Butz is one of the least known but most detrimental figures in American history.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, when I did the research, I actually did a YouTube video on him. I was just like at awe that how this one man in the administration changed the way we live right now. And I would say that I have some friends that laugh at me like, hey, you're spending so much money for organic food or going to the farmer's market, you better get better quality food. And I'm not as exposed as you are. You probably have many stories of people who had the old way of eating the standard American diet, then changed to the whole food eating that you're doing, like the story you told me, where their lives have changed. I think, what have you seen that we could tell the public that if we do adopt eating organic food and maybe more importantly, regenerative food, how would our lives change?
Yeah. Well, and just a quick note on that, you may not have seen yet, but they are now, there's now not only the organic label, but I think the USDA is approving a regenerative organic label because organic, I don't know if you've ever done an episode on this. Cornucopia Institute has done a great job. But organic has so many loopholes. I'll tell a quick story because your listeners might enjoy it. Years ago at the Buying Club, one of our members actually worked in the National Organic Program inside of the USDA. So he would fly out Monday morning to go to Washington to work for the week. He'd fly home Friday afternoon and he'd come straight to the Buying Club because it was near the airport to grab his family's food, and then he'd go home. And so he's working inside the National Organic Program, and he's what was known as a rule writer in the NOP, the NOP. And when the USD Organic Program was started, the idea was that over time the program would become more strict. That we would start with some loopholes and some allowances to make it easier for farmers to transition to stricter standards. So that was the whole original purpose of the NOP. What my friend watched happened in front of his very eyes as companies like Kroger and Costco adopted organic products was the NOP inverted its original mission, and they tried to make it easier and easier for more products to qualify as organic. So my friend was a rule writer. He's the one who writes the rules that farmers are supposed to follow in order to qualify for organic practices. And the people above him he turns in rules. Like, these are far too strict. He's like, we're already behind the level of strictness we were supposed to be 3 years ago. They're like, well, we don't want to be. And so he ended up getting fired, suing the government over it and winning. So organic has been so hollowed out that now they're making a regenerative organic one because organic really has so little meaning left in terms of, like, obviously, if I'm going to a grocery store, I'm going to generally buy an organic product over a non-organic product. But a lot of organic products, for all intents and purposes, are not raised that differently than conventional products anymore, except for maybe they're more limited in what chemicals they can use and what type of feed is offered to the animals.
Wow. And I read about this maybe a week or two ago, and actually somebody on the plane whose brother ran a cattle farm told me this. But and of course, I'm not in the farming community, so this might be common knowledge. But is it true that for cattle farmers, they're importing cows from other countries like Mexico and processing them here, or raising them, and then it's labeled made in the USA?
Yeah, there's all kinds of loopholes with the meat industry in America. Like, if you keep the animal on your operation for 45 days or something, it might be. I don't remember the exact number. This made the rounds a few years ago, but there are CAFO chicken operations in America that raise the chickens in America. They slaughter them in America, they freeze them, and then they ship the chickens to China to be processed, and then they ship it back to America to be sold. this just tells you how wild subsidies and regulations have made things, where it's cheaper for a chicken to travel 6,000 miles or more, frozen, 6,000 miles around the globe before it reaches your plate, than it is for you to raise a chicken in your backyard.
Yeah, I'm a little bit speechless. I kind of heard about that, but wow. I mean, that's the world we live in. Shipping it to China and back is cheaper than
Yeah.
processing in the US. Um, could you tell me more about like your food buying club and the terminology food freedom? Because that's becoming more common. And then maybe what do you do nowadays? Like what is sort of that flag you're planting in the ground that's making you wake up early in the morning and work on?
Yeah. So, Joel and I became friends back around 2011. Um, your listeners may not be familiar, uh, but in the late 1990s, there was a resurgent interest in real food and local food, kind of like what we saw in the late 60s, early 70s. But it was towards actual real food from actual farmers and people. So this made the food industry very, very nervous. And so by the early 2000s, the food industry leaned very heavily on the USDA and the FDA to begin cracking down on the growth in local food. It has a little bit of a cheesy name, but there's a great movie made by Kristen Canty, Canty, called Farmageddon, where I think she chronicles 10 or 11 stories from this period of time. Because basically, you're out in California, you've probably heard of Rossum. If you remember Rossum, it was a food buying club in California
Hmm.
that was raided multiple times by armed federal and state governmental officials, sometimes with guns drawn. You could go look it up on YouTube. It's absolute madness. So from late 1990s through about 2011 or 12, the government was raiding and shutting down raw milk farmers and local food buying clubs. So you had Rossum, you had Athens Locally Grown, you had Manna Storehouse in Ohio, and you have Pete Kennedy would remember a bunch of the farmers' names. The farmers' names, there's just so many of them. I can't even remember all their names anymore. And so in 2011, they raided my buying club in Louisville, Kentucky. And we were one of the first groups in the nation to be raided and walk away winners. And a few months after that happened, I got a phone call from some other people around the country who were just really sick and tired of the government harassing small farmers and the consumers who wanted to get food from them. And so the group of us basically spent 4 or so years waging open battle with the USDA and FDA, trying to get them to back off our farmers and to respect this idea of food freedom, so that you should be allowed to choose what you eat and who it comes from. Because again, to help your listeners, grocery stores give you the illusion of choice. So you go into a grocery store and you will see 280 different beef products from 114 different companies. That's the illusion of choice, because 85% of all beef consumed in America is controlled by 4 companies. That's the reality. All of these brands and faces are the illusion that you're getting a choice as to actually what you're eating. The reality is you're eating all of the same CAFO commodity cruelty beef. And this is true of pork. This is true of chicken, across the food system. And so, we took raw milk illegally from Pennsylvania, and we drank it on the footsteps of the FDA in Silver Springs, Maryland. And we called ahead and told them we were coming. So we did all of these civil disobedience and other events. We got involved in court cases like Vernon Hirschberger in Wisconsin, who that's just, you can go read some of the backstory on Vernon. Incredible story. He's just a farmer and a dad with a bunch of kids trying to feed his community. And he went toe to toe with the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection for 4 years until he finally won. But he risked jail and so much to do that. So in around 2011, the tide really began to turn on this issue, because a bunch of us were just like, I will go to jail before I will let you tell me what I can eat and what I feed my kids. But it was crazy because there was a court case at that time at the federal level where somebody sued the FDA over the interstate ban on sale and transit of raw milk. So the FDA bans the transport and sale of raw milk over state lines. They were sued, and in answering this lawsuit, the FDA said in writing that there is no fundamental right to food. There is no fundamental right to choose what you eat and who you get it from. You can go look up some of the breakdowns on the FDA's response to this lawsuit. And then what happened in some of these state level court cases we got involved with, there was one in Wisconsin or Minnesota, I believe, where the judge parroted the exact same thing the FDA said. And the judge said, there is no fundamental right to food, nor to choose what you feed your family. And then a few months later, after handing down this statement, the judge quit his judgeship and was hired by Monsanto. It doesn't get much more blatant than that.
Well, I mean, it's the same thing with the Department of Health. I mean, most of these executives go or are from Monsanto or other big industrial farms. So it's a feeding. They feed themselves. All right, I have one last question, because we're all about, this podcast is mostly like doom and gloom. Like, let's talk about hope. Let's talk about, because I think with perseverance, with the expansion of raw milk to many more states, you being in the forefront, what is the hope that you're seeing? What are the changes that you're seeing?
Well, so this is where, the fight of 2011 through 2016 has now led to really some of the greatest state level food regulatory changes that we've seen in 50 years. So a number of states, Utah, Maine, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, have all adopted incredibly wide-ranging food freedom laws. Some have even amended their constitutions to recognize a right to food. So there's been incredible progress in some parts of the country. in terms of making legislative or constitutional change. Like take a state like Tennessee. Frank Nicely, who's a senator in Tennessee, over the past decade has gotten past, I think, 60 some food freedom bills. And again, you're like, each bill is small, but it's kind of like change in your own life. It's sustainable. Every year he goes after 3 or 4 more things where he can give people more food freedom. You know, what fee can we get rid of? What license is not necessary? So there's been incredible headway made on these issues. And a lot of it, just so your readers know who to support, is thanks to an organization by the name of Institute for Justice. So they are the premier national food freedom organization. So many of these legislative changes were driven by average people like you and I, who then receive support from someone like Institute for Justice or somebody like Frank Nicely or et cetera, et cetera. So that's been great. Joel Salatin and I, because Joel and I became friends years ago, we started a conference solely devoted to these kind of issues of food and health freedom called Rogue Food. And there's just nothing like the Rogue Food Conference. And so we've been putting that conference on twice a year. We move it all around the country. And that's been great because people come together and they start food buying clubs. They start alternative butchering operations. We're going after all of these bottlenecks that are what block people from accessing real food from good farmers. And the COVID was one of the greatest gifts ever to our side in the sense of, Thomas Massey's Prime Act and other pieces of legislation, which would be the first rollbacks to the federal meat inspection system we've ever seen. Those are only even possible because people saw how broken that system was. So many of my friends remember walking into grocery stores and watching them remove the meat cases because they knew there wasn't going to be meat. They knew they weren't ever going to be, it was going to be years before they were going to be able to restock the meat cases because of the disruptions in the meat system. And people saw the articles, that millions of pigs were being euthanized because there was nowhere to butcher them. And people are like, this is insane. And then they discover, not only do only 4 pork producers control 85% of all the pork in America, but there's only 20 pork processing plants for the entire nation. And so it's been a great 4 or 5 years making progress on these issues. We just need to get more people into the game.
And on that note, my last thought question for you is this. If you have the ability to send a text to everyone in the world, what would that text be?
Buy Bitcoin? Just kidding. Oh man, in terms of this issue, so let's, because there's a lot of things I'd say to the world if I could speak to the entire world. But related to the issue of food and health, I like the phrase, choose food with a face. So when I sit down to eat, if I'm eating a steak, I know the family's face who raised that steak. If I'm eating a chicken, I know that chicken might have came from my friend Luke Gross's farm, or it came from Aaron Fisher. When I make myself a smoothie, my son's in the background saying we raise most of our own chicken.
That's
So,
good.
um, when I eat a smoothie, I hear Aaron Fisher and his wife's voice saying to me how our buying club choosing their farm um, literally saved their family farm. So choose food with a face. Choose people who will actually care whether or not your dollar is spent with them.
John Moody, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me, and I appreciate your insights.
Yeah, it's been wonderful. Again, it is a pleasure to get to see you. Actually, your face, and I'm just grateful for what you're doing because, again, I really think my cold and flu season immunity was the best it's ever been because your supplement had something I've been lacking in my diet.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Great. Well, great. To your listeners, come to a Rogue Food Conference. If you've never been to Salatin's Farm or some of the other places we go, I'd love to see you all in person because is one of the most powerful things you can do to change our nation is change who you eat and where you buy your food from.
Awesome. Thank you, John.
Great. Have a wonderful day.